Witch in Charm's Way, a cozy mystery audiobook, written and narrated by R.K. Dreaming. Part 22. Chapter 13. Willow Manor. When it got to near 5 o'clock, past sunset, I told Aunt Adele that I had to go home for the Saturday family gathering that evening. She gave me a sympathetic look and wished me luck. The cafe was still bustling with customers, but she reassured me that she was perfectly capable of taking care of them all by herself. "What time will you be back, dear?" she said. "Late? Did I hear you making a date with that handsome young incubus, Jasper?" "It's not a date," I told her. She gave me a small smile and said nothing. "It's really not," I protested. I had agreed to meet Jasper at Club Nocturne that night. Someone there had to have seen Lily after the others had left. Maybe they had even seen who she had been waiting for. I went back up to my tower room to get ready. Aunt Adele had lent me some of her robes, which was probably a good thing because Granny Selma was very traditional and set in her ways. She didn't approve of non-witching clothing, and if I had turned up in anything else, jeans in particular, she would have had more than a few sharp words to say about it. She might even send me home to get changed. I decided not to test my luck and put on a set of Aunt Adele's peacock blue robes that went all the way down to my ankles. It wasn't too loose on me because this was something that she had owned in her youth. It was outdated in fashion. Even so, I quite liked the ruffled neckline and the sweeping sleeves and flaring skirt. It felt like battle armour in its own way. It would not do, however, for the club later on tonight. With nothing suitable to wear in my meagre wardrobe, I was going to have to ask Allegra if I could borrow some clothes. This was a nice thought. Allegra had always been slimmer than me, and now, thanks to my furiously fast metabolism, I was going to be able to share clothes with her. She wouldn't mind me borrowing something. After eyeing up what cash remained in my purse, I decided I didn't have anywhere near enough for a taxi. I would have to take a swift 40-minute hike down to Willow Manor, and it might take me even longer in the dark. I tucked my wand into my pocket to take with me. It probably wasn't the safest idea to go walking to Willow Manor. The route there passed near the Grim Forest. Brimstone Bay town and beach themselves were usually safe, but the Grim Forest could be a different story. Every once in a while it attracted feral eldritch beings, not to mention the usual pesky creatures that lived in there year-round. I decided it would be safer to take the beach route into town, even though it was longer. But then, just as I was getting ready to leave, Allegra arrived. Aunt Adele floated up to tell me that she was waiting for me in the Castle Cafe. I arrived to find her looking her usual gorgeous self, her sleek dark hair left loose, and wearing elegant lilac robes that looked gorgeous with her warm golden skin. Allegra hugged me when she saw me. "I thought we could ether hop home together," she said. I made a face. I did not enjoy ether hopping, and it had been a long time since I had done it. It felt like being squeezed and stretched and shaken all at the same time, and had always left me feeling a bit nauseous. But I didn't turn her down, since she had taken the trouble to come here. We went out into the cafe garden, which was empty given the damp day. I slipped my arm into the crook of Allegra's elbow and closed my eyes out of habit when I felt Allegra's arm tighten on mine. It was just like I remembered. There was a sensation of being squeezed very tightly and stretched very thin. My stomach revolted violently, and I couldn't breathe, and the darkness behind my eyelids became even darker, and then it was all over. I only landed upright on my feet because Allegra was holding on to me. I opened my eyes to see her laughing at me. "Shut up," I said. "You know I've always hated doing that." "It's because you haven't had enough practice," she said. That's because I didn't want to get ether-frayed, I said. She gave me a look as if to say, you won't know unless you try. We had arrived in a completely different place. I felt a tiny bit astonished by the instant arrival, like a humble would have, but only because I had lived away from Brimstone Bay for so long. The novelty would wear away fast. We were standing in a green landscape of perfectly manicured gardens. Up ahead of me was Willow Manor. I eyed it with some degree of trepidation. It was funny how looking at your childhood home and knowing who was within it could make you feel like a teenager all over again. I had not been back to Willow Manor since the day I had left, aged 18, and determined to make my way in the humble world. What confidence I had been filled with back then, and what naivety. My mouth had gone suddenly dry. Allegra tugged my arm. Come on, let's just get it over with. She had done me the favour of arriving some distance back along the driveway so that we could walk up together and I could get used to the idea. We trudged up the stone path, and I couldn't help but admire the view ahead of me. When I was a kid, this place had just been home. Now I was seeing it with new eyes. Willow Manor looked like a cross between a duke's palace and an aristocrat's stately home, which it was in a way. It was named Willow Manor because it stood on the banks of a large lake with 100 enormous weeping willow trees all around it. It had hundreds of rooms inside, which looked out upon the beautifully landscaped gardens. My favourite had been the children's garden with the paddling pool fountains, where my cousins and I had spent many happy childhood summers. My heart flip-flopped in a mixture of joy and nerves as we got closer. Remember, it's always best to eat the frog first thing in the morning, joked Allegra, giving my arm a comforting squeeze. It makes me feel like a little kid again, I said, and not in a good way. Is she still a dragon? Always, said Allegra. The family poltergeist butler, Fraser, opened the door and bowed at me slightly. Madam, he said. I burst into laughter. Fraser, it's only me. I'm quite aware of that, madam, he said in his pompous voice. Welcome home. You're making me feel like a stranger. You have been a stranger, madam, he said, his nose in the air as he glided off to carry out his duties. No ghost had ever been able to glide so snootily as Fraser. Allegra and I looked at each other and chuckled quietly, not wanting him to hear and be offended. He's exactly the same, I whispered. She nodded. So is Miles. My eyes lit up. And Domino? She'll be with the kids in the family lounge, said Allegra. I smiled fondly. Domino was my favourite of the family poltergeists. The family gatherings were held in 2 different lounges next door to each other, one where the adults assembled like courtiers around Granny Selma, and the other where the children ran around like little heathens, as Granny liked to say. I was tempted to put my head into the children's lounge first, but I refrained. I didn't want to offend Granny. Allegra walked into the adults' lounge ahead of me and cried out cheerfully, Look who's home! I was glad for the light-hearted energy she tried to inject into the moment. Granny Selma was not to be swayed so easily, however. I barely noticed everyone else in the room. My eyes went directly to her, our unmistakable matriarch. She was sitting in her usual spot in her favourite armchair at one end of the room. A dark-haired elderly lady now in her early 80s. She was thinner than I recalled. She seemed a little frailer somehow, and yet as frightening as ever. And so the prodigal returns, does she? She said, fixing her piercing dark eyes on me, and my dyed hair in particular. It wasn't meant kindly, as evidenced by the bite in her tone. And yet I was enveloped with a sudden wash of affection, so I went over and gave her a warm hug. I've missed you too, Granny. I almost expected her to push me away, but instead she patted my back and sniffed only a little haughtily and said, "Well, I suppose it's good to have you home." I couldn't believe it. That was as good a stamp of approval as she would ever give me. There was a collective sigh of relief from across the room, and my mum in particular was beaming. She held out her arms, and I ran across to wrap her in a warm embrace. "Mummy, I've missed you." "Yuck," said Allegra light-heartedly. "You are such a mummy's girl." "That's because I've got the best mum in the world," I said. And she really was. Eleanor Westbrim, fondly called Evie by everyone in her family, was the most kind-hearted of the lot of us. Mum had been a great beauty in her youth, and even at nearly 60, remnants of it remained in her clear brown eyes, her rosy cheeks, and her warm, shy smile. "Hey!" protested my Aunt Circe. She was Mum's younger sister and was mother to Allegra, Viv and Fluffy, and their younger brother Gabriel, who was away studying at Magic-Wild Academy. "And you're the second best," I said to her fondly, and went across to give her a big hug. She looked much like my mum, only a bit less plump, and the years had not aged her as much. And she looked wonderful in her stylish floral printed robes. One might even have mistaken her for an older sister to her grown daughters. She looked absolutely delighted to see me, and it warmed my heart. "It's good to see you at home again," she said, "and don't you dare leave it so long next time." She leaned in closer and whispered in my ear, "Now what's this about a murder?" Hi, you've reached the end. Comment the code words, "You know nothing, Jon Snow," to confuse everyone who hasn't reached this part of the story yet. Thanks for playing along.